Welcome to our webinar and good afternoon to all our participants and panelists. Thank you very much for joining us to the first ALPTREES webinar in the lifetime of our Interreg Alpine Space project, ALPTREES. I have prepared a few slides to introduce you to our project and to warm you up for the upcoming webinar. Let me share my slides with you. So once again, officially welcome to the ALPTREES webinar. And many thanks to our panelists, Sylvain Guetaz from France, Giuseppe Brundu from Italy, Anja Bindewald from Germany, Aleksander Marinsek from Slovenia, Florian Kraxner from Austria, and Debojyoti Chakraborty also from Austria in Vienna. So this is the program which waits for you today. But first, let me explain you some words about our project with the title A Transnational Cooperation for the Sustainable Use Management of Non-Native Trees in Urban, Peri-urban and Forest Ecosystem in the Alpine region. Let's have a look together in the Alpine region, in the Alpine space. It's a region of 49 sub-regions and the home for about 70 million inhabitants. The area stretches over 450 square kilometers with an increasing forest cover. Our project has already detected 135 native tree species growing in this area, and we have found so far 633 non-native tree species. But what are these non-native tree species? You might know also the term exotic trees, alien trees, or introduced tree species for them. This term includes all tree species, breeds and hybrids, which are a result of human activity, which have intentionally or unintentionally introduced these species into the alpine space. So this is our definition, which we have put in place right in the beginning of our project. So here are some better known non-native tree species like the grey ash, Douglas fir, or the northern red oak. But if you remember from these two slides before, we have 633 non-native tree species occurring in the alpine space. In this graph, you see at the grey bars the number of non-native species in urban areas. In the green bar, you see the number of tree species in forests, and in the blue bar, you see the number of tree species in both in forests and in urban areas. You can see that these are pretty similar shares all over the countries in the alpine space. Why are we so interested in the topic of non-native tree species? Non-natives can have positive impacts. They can help to adapt to climate change, they can contribute to the bioeconomy, and they are usually a very important part of the green urban infrastructure all over the urban spaces in the alpine space. On the other hand, we have observed severe negative impacts of some non-native tree species. They might cause significant impacts on biodiversity, human health, and economy. They are a real ecological risks for protected areas or the entire ecosystems and their ecosystem services. And they are impacting natural processes, natural competition. So that's seeing this positive and negative impacts. Many regions in the alpine space have responded very differently based on their experiences and practical uses of non-native tree species, which has led into a very incoherent and patchy landscape of policies, regulations, and recommendations on how to use non-native tree species. We have felt that there is a need to develop a strategy on the management of responsible use of non-native tree species for the entire alpine space region. Apart from this big aim of our project, we want to develop risk assessment tools for the practitioners, for everyone, to analyze the risks of non-native tree species. We want to develop risk maps to predict and project the ecosystem dynamics and the climate change scenarios. And all this information, the experiences we gain and we produce in form of training material will be available in the ALPTREES Knowledge Hub. So once again, here is our project team consisting of 12 partners from all over the Alpine space. Unfortunately, this was the only time we've met in person due to COVID-19 measures and restrictions for traveling. It was a very hard time for us to not meet, but this makes us even more happier that you participate in these digital activities we have put in place to mitigate this challenge in this challenging time. So how do you want to if you want to stay in touch with the ALPTREES project, you can apply to the newsletter, you can listen to our podcasts and follow us on all different social media channels, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. So last but not least, we'd like to invite you to actively participate in the digital conference of ALPTREES, where we have plenary sessions, keynote presentations, sessions on risks of invasive trees, sessions on the management of native tree species, and an under 18 session, which should give the young citizens in the alpine space opportunity to talk about their views, fears, and experiences with trees, with forests, with urban green infrastructure, and the perspectives of climate change. In a policy workshop, we will aim to develop with you more keystones for our strategy on the sustainable use of non-native tree species. So stay tuned. This digital conference will take place on February 25th and 26th online. Thank you very much. And now, I would like to introduce you to our first keynote speaker of this webinar. Sylvain Guetaz from France is not just a member of the executive board of the EUSALP strategy, a macro-regional strategy of the European Union, but also the leader of the Action Group 2, which aims to increase the economic potential of strategic sectors. Thank you very much.
For Germany, but geographic scope is generally the same, including 7 states, of which 5 EU member states, and 48 regions. French regions, Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, and Burgundy-Franche-Comté for leading actually the French presidency of EUSALP with the French state. As you may know, EUSALP has been launched in 2018 and was chaired by Slovenia originally, followed by Germany, by Bavaria in 2017, by Austria, Tyrol, and by Italy in 2019. And since this year, France is chairing the EUSALP, the strategy, and will continue to do it next year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. Why EUSALP? EUSALP is one of the 4 macro strategy in Europe, but this is based on a shared observation because, as you all know, Alpine region is a globally prosperous region enjoying a good quality of life. But nevertheless, this region is threatened by some negative effects of economic globalization, which could lead to weaken traditional economic sectors, and which could also lead to competitive pressure on high value added sectors. The region is also threatened by demographic phenomena of aging and exodus, and in the field of environment and agriculture, because you are working also on agriculture and on environment, this region is also affected threatened and affected by the climate change on both mountain ecosystem and human activities. And of course, we have also seen many negative externalities on road freight transport and about growing territorial disparities. So EUSALP is based on shared conviction that we are facing many challenges, and we have to transcend our political and administrative boundaries for a better coordination, both on technical and on political level. The main action of EUSALP, we have three political pillars, three political priorities. The first is on the access to employment. We have three pillars divided, and then these three pillars are also divided in 9 action groups. You have it on the screen concerning the equitable access to employment. First, concerning the ecosystem of innovation and research, that's the action group 1. The importance of developing and increasing the economic potential of strategic sectors, action group 2, and among these strategic sectors, the sector of timber industry, wood and forest is particularly important for us. I will come back to this a bit later. And we have also the question of education and its adaptation to the labor markets, which is the task of action group 3. The second pillar, this is the sustainable internal and external accessibility, which is dealing especially concerning the question of transport of passengers and freight transportation. This is action group 4, and concerning the digital connectivity between peoples and the question of access to public services, which is the task of action group 5. Finally, the third pillar, which is divided into 4 action group. This is the pillar of environmental and environmental framework and reliable energy, with 4 action group. The first group is on natural resources. This is action group 6. The ecological continuities, the action group 7, and the risk management, including natural hazards. This is the action group 8. Concerning the last action group, it is devoted to energy efficiency and renewable energy. This is the action group 9. What could be certainly more interesting for you? This is the question of economic and ecological issue, the action of the French EUSALP presidency for forestry. The stakes of ALPINE forestry are well known. This is the revival of important sectors. This is the importance of the regional economy, the creation of local jobs, the sustainable development and the promotion of short circuits, which is particularly important for the sectors of timber industry and wood and forests. We have some achievement you will see on the right side of the slide. They are funded by ARPA funds. This is the case for Triple Wood Project, for Transalp project, and concerning the Alpine Space funds, it's funding Circular Alps project. So we have some achievement in that issue, but nevertheless we would like to continue to have a deeper reflection and more continuous action concerning this challenge we are facing too. Triplewood project. Triplewood project. This is an important project consisting in an exhibition of best practices example from 7 countries concerning many realization in the field of construction material, and also dealing with wood construction with some seminars, internet site, and so on. I can advise you to consult the website on Triplewood. Next slide, please. Circular project. Circular ALPTREES project. This is the promotion of circular and bioeconomy in the alpine timber sectors. You certainly know about this circular project, which consists in analyzing current states of art and best practices, in evaluating the specific potential of some innovative practices, and highlighting also transferring factors. So for this issue, I also insist on the consultants of, if you would like to have more information, please consult the circular project on alpineregion.eu. Next slide. Yeah, concerning the action plan by the French presidency and the subgroup of woods in the frame of Action Group 2, we have four priorities. First priorities, this is to develop local exploitation of alpine woods. That's why the question of geographic labeling is particularly important. We would like to develop the timber industry, particularly this, which is aiming the local consumption. And we also would like to develop our links to the Alpine Space programs. And of course, the example of ALPTREES is particularly interesting. That's why I've mentioned this project here. And we have a proposal concerning the promotion of regional labels. And our proposal, this is to have a survey concerning the wood construction with a region-oriented eco-label. This is very clear that concerning sustainable building would have many advantages. And we would like to encourage the use of woods in building sectors, and appropriate information concerning this building sector is also needed about the qualities, but also concerning the origin of the woods. That's why we have seen in the last decades several labeling initiatives, certain labeling initiatives dealing with the quality of the wood, but also dealing with the origins and the geographic perimeter of this woods. That's why, capitalizing on this information, we would like to carry out a study to understand what this extent this wood construction labeling could be also proposed on the Alpine region in its entire dimension. Next slide, please. And the goals of the survey could be to be better informed and to know better the challenge concerning the promotion of geographic labeling. We would like to have two preliminary activities that we could propose for the time being. The first, this is a survey of existing labeling initiatives, because we have many initiatives through all the Alpine space, and the survey could depict and could show us the existing labeling and their comparative analysis. So a sort of assessment, of general assessment of existing initiatives, and the organization of a meeting, of a virtual meeting, I guess, even next year, could be organized among players involved in the initiatives and stakeholders. This could take the form of a seminar, of a conference, for deepening the discussion, and to encourage the mutual learning about their approaches and the communication strategies concerning the wood labeling. Thank you for your attention, and I guess I'm here for exchanging with you on this proposal concerning wood labeling, but also if you have any general remarks or questions on EUSALP and on Action Group 2. I would also inform you that Action Group 2 will have its session next week on November the 10th, and that the subgroup on wood will certainly hold its own session. And if you are interested in joining the subgroup on wood, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvain, for your very good overview about the activities of all action groups, but also particularly for also coming up with possibilities how we could collaborate. Perhaps there are questions in the audience. Here is one question of a participant. How can I join an action group?
It depends of your countries. For Austria, for instance, you certainly could join an action group leaders, or your national coordinator, for informing us that you are interested in joining the action group. This is the Federal Ministry for Environment. This is Michael Roth for the case of Austria. For other countries, for instance, you could send me an email, and of course I will contact your national coordinator, and to be sure that your organization is involved in our fields of activities. That's from a very pragmatic point of view, this is the best way to do, but it's always in close coordination with the national coordinators of EUSALP in your country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much also for the opportunity for our participants to learn about how to be actively involved in EUSALP. I think this is a very, very important part of this macro-regional strategy. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Giuseppe Brundu. He is an agronomist and botanist and working since many years at the front line of EU policy and research on invasive species. And I'm very happy you're here today with us because he has initiated already several years ago the need for a global guideline on how to work with non-native tree species and to be aware of their risks. And Giuseppe, thank you very much for being here with us, and we would like to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katharina, for organizing the webinar and for inviting me. I have registered the presentation just to stick on the slot time of 15 minutes, but of course I will be here and happy to reply to any question. So if you can start the presentation. Thank you.
Something went wrong? 1 second.
Yeah. You should probably press
Here you
F5, F5 to start the automatic presentation.
Okay. Okay, it's done so far.
If not, in any case, I can present, no problem.
But you see the slides?
Yes, but not in the full screen mode.
Okay, 1 second. Oh, sorry for these technical details. So let's try again. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good. It's yours.
So it should start automatically.
I think I will have to click for you.
Okay, so
Sorry.
probably there is a software incompatibility, no problem. I'm going to present the ideas in these global guidelines for the sustainable use of non-native trees and what was done before it. All the information has already been recently published as a scientific paper on Neobiota journal. Next, please. Non-native trees and sustainable managed plantation of forest provide a wide range of forest goods and services, and their presence in different regions of the world can be very, very significant, as you can see in this slide. Next, please. However, it is also well known that in many cases, plantation of non-native trees have launched invasions with very negative impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And there are some cases in which plantation with non-native trees are a kind of ticking bombs, so they may cause impact in the future. Of course, we need to use non-native trees, so the challenge is to try a good compromise and also save the future land use. In this graph, it is shown the situation concerning the fact that some trees provide benefit and some other negative impact, and this generate conflict between species. Next, please. During 2019, just before the EMAPI conference in Prague, Czech Republic, a workshop was held with the idea of producing these global guidelines. The idea was in relation to the Code of Conduct for Invasive Alien Trees that was approved in the framework of the Berne Convention by the Council of Europe, and that was also published as a scientific paper. So this was the starting basis to produce these global guidelines. Next, please. Non-native trees, as you certainly know, are present in a wide range of different land uses, and they are used for many different purposes. In forest trials, as protection forest, short rotation forestry, short rotation copies, agroforestry, sand dune stabilization, and so on. So there are really many introduction pathways and many purposes for using them. Next, please. But the idea of these global guidelines is related also to the fact that very recently huge massive tree planting campaigns of non-native trees starting to take place in many parts of the world, sometimes as a final solution to mitigate climate change and for other purposes. But of course, not every tree can be planted everywhere. Next one, please. And this graph just to highlight not all, but just a significant part of this global campaign for planting new trees everywhere. Like, for example, the green wall in Africa, the green wall in China, and many other similar activities all around. So the idea of these global guidelines is to address all relevant stakeholders, and considering the large amount of purposes for which non-native trees are used, this number of stakeholders is really high. Next one, please. And of course, these recommendations are not an exhaustive list. I will recall also at the end that, of course, there is the need to local implementation according to the regional situation. However, we think that they can give useful information, particularly in the case where non-native trees are planned to be used over very large areas. And we are also suggesting a kind of logo that can be used by stakeholders that are interested in applying these global guidelines. Next, please. So there are in total 8 recommendations. They are clustered in 3 overarching goals, which concern the prevention of introduction of non-native trees that may become invasive, action to prevent the risk of escape of non-native trees from plantation site to adjoining area, and also recommendation helping to mitigate the negative impact of those non-native trees that are already invasive species. And we think that these 8 recommendations can be also framed in the context of a significant number of sustainable development goals of the United Nations as shown in this graph. Next, please. So let's go more in the details of these global guidelines. I take the opportunity also to thank Katharina, who was the drawer of this very nice picture that itemized all these 8 recommendations. She's also a co-author of this work. So first of all, the first recommendation concerns the preferential use of non-native trees. So we are not asking not to use, but we're asking to make a preferential use of native trees. And in those cases where native trees are not an option, then to evaluate the possibility to use non-native trees with a low invasion risk. It's probably impossible to don't have any risk, but it's certainly possible to have a lower risk of invasions. Next, please. And the idea of a preferential use of native trees is not brand new. For example, the most important certification schemes like FC and PFC do already have some principle related to this point. Second recommendation is to be aware of regulation. This recommendation may seem trivial, but it is not, because if we go to the next slide, we see this recent paper that was done in the framework of the cost action. And this study about the European legislation revealed that there are 335 legal instruments if we take into account the 116 geopolitical legal units. In fact, as you certainly know, we have a different regulation inside the country, in federal countries, for example, and in countries like Italy, where there are regions. Another recommendation is to be aware of the risk of invasion and consider global change trend. So when we are choosing the species, we should keep in mind that there will be change in the future. And all the decision about this should be based on the best available knowledge from considering also experience from other areas of the world. Next one, please. The fourth recommendation go more into details to the silvicultural practices, and recall the need to be aware that there are certain practices that can reduce the problem from invasive species, but sometimes at the same time can promote the spread of other. One example is the prescribed fire can solve some problem, but can originate other problems concerning invasive tree. And similarly, for example, in the case of Robinia pseudacacia and Ailanthus altissima, certain type of management, like for example cutting, can again encourage the vegetative spread of these non-native trees. Next one, please. And in the guidelines, there are, of course, many other more practical recommendations, and I will not go through the details. For example, there are ideas concerning the management of eucalyptus, which is not, of course, important for the alpine space, but very relevant for Portugal, Spain, but also for the Mediterranean in general. Next one, please. Fifth recommendation is about the need to promote and implement early detection and rapid response program. This slide is from New Zealand, and it is an intervention for the rapid eradication of conifer wildings. Next one, please. Concerning this recommendation, of course, citizen science can be a tool to take into careful consideration, and there are already examples of the application of citizen science for early warning. The sixth recommendation is about the need to design, plan, and adopt tailored practice for invasive non-native trees control when they are invasive, habitat restoration, and for dealing with highly modified ecosystems. There are many situations, including Europe, in which we have a kind of novel wood formation by non-native trees. And of course, this is a challenge concerning the management. So again, this recommendation provides some concerns, some ideas about this activity. Next one, please. There are, of course, many restoration activities going around at the global scale. This is, for example, an image from Canary Islands, where the Pinus radiata has been removed, providing the recovering of the natural forest and eventually of the native Pinus of Canary Islands. And many other similar activities are going all around. The seventh recommendation is a very cross-cutting one, like the eighth recommendation, and highlighted the need to engage with stakeholders, as they are key in the management of the non-native trees, but also in any forest management in general concerning native and non-native trees. We try to classify the different type of stakeholders that can be involved in this process, and this is a table from the paper with some ideas on how to classify them and what is the relationship between these stakeholder groups and the 8 recommendations in the guidelines. Next, please. And finally, the final 8 recommendation is about the need to develop and support global networks, collaborative research activities, and in particular information sharing, for example, for management, for risk assessment, for invasion risk, both on native and non-native trees. And for example, also this webinar today go toward this direction. So in conclusion, these global guidelines offer general recommendation for the use of non-native trees and the management of invasive non-native trees. But it's very important to bear in mind that, of course, they are very general and they need to be adjusted, modified, implemented at national and even sometimes at subnational, regional level, with peculiar attention to specific context and specific species. We are fully aware of the fact that it's not possible to have guidelines of the type one size fits all. I also would like to acknowledge all the people that have helped to the production of these guidelines, Rodrigo Pintos for the preparation of the logo, and all the other co-authors. And I apologize because maybe I ran out of time due to this unexpected technical problem. Sorry, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe, for giving us a global view on the work on non-native tree species, some specific recommendations which have been formulated. I can see some hands up, and then there is a question, or at least a hand up from Nicola Laporta. is the question still on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Please state your question.
Hello, Giuseppe. Hi.
Ciao, ciao Nicola.
I would like to know about if there is any kind of special guide for ornamental trees instead of forest trees. You know, of course as not native, because of course they need perhaps different, not perhaps, different management, different practice to cultivate or to eradicate or to avoid, to escape. Is there any different guidelines for ornamentals? Hello?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Nicola. I can hear you perfectly. Thank you for the question, because it gives me the opportunity to remark a point. Actually, in the guidelines, there are information not only for the, let's say, traditional plantation forest, but there are also information about the general use of non-native trees, including peri-urban and urban forest, and also arboreta and ornamental trees. And we highlight the fact that, for example, in the case of the urban, in the green in towns, sometimes you may use more freely non-native species, because sometimes in the urban, let's say in the urban ecosystem, they might be more resistant to some stress factor. And so, yes, we provide also some suggestion, highlighting the fact that, of course, when you are managing an open space like a plantation forest, or you are working in a protected area, of course, the guidelines will be applied in different way in relation to green in towns. I hope this was the point of your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giuseppe. And unfortunately, we don't have time for much more questions, but we are going to share your contact details with the participants. So if you want more information on Giuseppe's work at global level, please get also directly in touch with him. And we are very happy that we are in a very close dialogue also within this project for future workshops working on a strategy for the alpine space. Thank you very much, Giuseppe. Thank you. So now we have reached a moment in the program which is titled ALPTREES Behind the Scenes. Eugenio from Italy was asking a question if we cover also if it also includes flatland and urban peri-urban woodlands, and if we considered this in the analysis of our 663 alien species. Of course, we have collected data within these regions which I showed you on this map, and we have collected non-native tree species occurrences from any ecosystem we could reach. And we will additionally start next year an e-naturalist project. We will use citizen science to get more information of the occurrences of non-native tree species in these peri-urban areas. I also see hands up from Shimon Herbeck. You can also now state your question if you unmute yourself.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually there was a mistake. I just wanted to click to chat to answer the question.
Okay, so thank you very much for attending this this workshop, and of course this webinar was not only organized by myself. I had a fantastic team that was helping me, and I'd like to give them a second in front of the screen to introduce you. So first of all, who wants to come first? First of all, Petra Meisel, she's also our communication officer, and she was preparing this webinar in terms of that you heard about it. So thank you very much. She's also creating most of the communication you see is going through her hands. So thank you very much, Petra, for assisting in this webinar. And then I also would like to thank our IT support here at the Austrian Forest Research Center by Willi, Willi Notch. And thank you very much. He is having this silent eye on this event and helping and assisting me with the ITs. Thank you very much for both of you. And we continue with now a session on short presentation. So I'd like to give 3 project partners the possibility to give some insights from the work, from some selected topic in their work packages. And I'd like to start with Anja Bindewald. She's also the work package leader of work package number 1, which does some tremendous work on collecting data on non-native tree species. So this is the section of short presentations. Of course, that's why we will collect your questions and ask them in the end after all 3 partners have spoken. Anja, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my short presentation. I will share my screen. So can you hear me well? This is the first important question.
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay. So.
Yes, it works. We can see the slides if you share them now on the full screen.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yes, it works.
Perfect. So, yeah, I will give you a short overview today on the topic assessing the invasion risks of widely cultivated non-native tree species in forests. So first, let's get the terms straight, because there's quite a bit of confusion and inconsistency in that area. So risk. This term is used to describe the possibility of something bad happening. It involves uncertainty about the effects, and it often focuses on undesirable consequences with respect to something that humans value, for example, the environment. So the invasion risk, this term can be defined as the probability that undesirable consequences occur when non-native tree species are introduced and cultivated. The risk assessment, or assessing the invasion risk, can be defined as the evaluation of the possibility of undesirable consequences related to the introduction, establishment, and spread of a non-native tree species. And the risk management is based on the results of the risk assessment. And the major purpose here is to identify appropriate management options to reduce the risks of negative impacts. So please keep these terms in mind for the next slides. So as we already heard during the presentation of Giuseppe, it's really some non-native tree species can be challenging. So we have to balance the positive and the negative impacts, and the communication on these between the various actors and the various stakeholders remains a key challenge. So on the one hand, non-native tree species are being valued for the ecosystem services. And primarily, non-native tree species have been used for afforestation of degraded sites, of course, for the production of timber, and with the ongoing effects of climate change, some drought-tolerant non-native tree species are increasingly discussed to replace some native tree species in the face of climate change. On the other hand, some non-native tree species have been considered invasive. For example, because they have changed species compositions, or in the worst case, they have caused loss of native species. For example, because non-native tree species alter the structure and functions of ecosystems, And also because some non-native tree species have negative impacts on social economy. For example, when they compete with native tree species that are being valued for their ecosystem services. And of course, particularly in sensitive ecosystems, non-native tree species may have a substantial detrimental impact, such as in areas of high conservation value, like also the European Union habitat types. And of course, when a non-native tree species spreads and establishes in such sensitive ecosystems, it causes conflicts with nature conservation objectives. And one example here is the Douglas fir, which has spread and established in semi-natural oak forest areas in southwest Germany, and therefore has caused some controversial discussions on the use and management of this tree species. So overall, the key challenge in this context, we already heard it, is to balance the ecosystem service and the invasion risks. And so the key challenge here is to benefit on the one hand from the ecosystem services provided by the non-native tree species, while on the same time minimizing the negative effects or the undesired effects. These effects are usually confined to particular processes in ecosystems. So consequently, the challenge in this context could be addressed by identifying ecosystem types that are most sensitive to invasion, and on the same time identify those areas where the non-native tree species can be cultivated with a low risk of invasion. In our ALPTREES project, we have formulated important objectives, and based on these, some do's and don'ts for non-native tree species risk assessments. First of all, the risk assessment should be relevant. Means that the results of a risk assessment should provide meaningful guidance for landscape planners, managers, or conservationists. So in order to identify appropriate management options for this part that I called the risk management. So in order to do that, So for the relevance, we therefore recommend to consider the extent of the area which is affected by the non-native tree species, and to consider the type of ecosystem where impacts potentially occur. Second, the risk assessment should be transparent and reliable. So this means that we should try to strengthen the evidence base by using, if available, of course, monitoring data to quantify the establishment and spread of a non-native tree species. For example, we could use national forest inventories or regional inventories which cover, for example, protected areas. So therefore, our recommendation is we should not assume the invasiveness, for example, following the precautionary principle, but instead we should underpin the assessment with scientific evidence if the data is available, and we should carefully describe and discuss the type of data that we are using for the risk assessment. And third, it's also very important how we communicate on the results of the risk assessment. So we should be very explicit when communicating on the risks posed by non-native tree species and on the management options to reduce the risks. And here we recommend we should not provide one absolute risk category. So the final outcome of such a risk assessment should not be that the non-native tree species is classified as invasive or as a blacklist species, but instead we should provide a stratified assessment of the risks posed by the non-native tree species, which distinguishes among the different ecosystem types. And last, we also recommend that we should avoid the term invasive, and instead we should refer to the specific site and to the specific stage of the biological invasion, so the establishment, spread, or impact. So one of our ALPTREES deliverables is to develop a manual for site-specific risk assessments of non-native tree species in the alpine space. And we have already started to work on a framework for site-specific risk assessment. We have formulated the different steps which should be applied or followed when assessing site-specific risks. And we have also started to develop a decision tree for the application of the site-specific risk assessment. However, we are still discussing and preparing this, so I'm not able to share this with you today. And also, of course, I don't have the time to do that. But there will be future opportunities coming up for discussing more in details this manual and also the invasion risks of non-native tree species, for example, in the digital conference of ALPTREES in February 2021. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anja, for really briefly summing up a tremendous part of work. Our next, thank you very much. Our next speaker for a short presentation is Aleksander Marinsek with the topic on the management of non-native tree species. Thank you, Aleksander.
Yes, hi. Thanks for inviting me to have a presentation. I will try to share my screen now. So do you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Now it's even better?
It's much better.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would like to, it's quite hard task to explain non-native trees management in 5 minutes, but let me try. So the major threats to alpine space are, as Sylvain told us a lot in the first keynote speak, are climate change and also human activities. So as mitigation is no longer the best option, the adaptation efforts are required to respond to the negative effects on the alpine environment, economy, and society. So the rapid response, the rapid rate of climate change may overcome the natural ability of forest ecosystem to adapt to those changes. So this leads to increased risk of disturbances such as storms, fire, pests, and disease, with implication for forest growth and reproduction. So range shifts in forestry species due to climate change have been observed towards high altitudes and to latitudes. So our future climate change and increasing CO2 concentrations are expected to affect site suitability, productivity, species composition, and also our biodiversity. So the projected changes in alpine space in Europe and elsewhere will have an impact on the goods, also on the services that forests provide us. So there was, according to ADAPT, this is a platform and there's a partnership between the European Commission and the European Environment Agency. They thought that value of forest land in Europe is projected to decrease between 14 and 50% during the 21st century. Therefore, that means we need to react, and we need to react on different levels. So actions to maintain and enhance forest resilience and also adaptive capacity to ensure sustainable forest management. So non-native tree species could be a part of that solution, and non-native tree species can support the adaptation of European forests and also in urban areas to climate change, but on the other side, simultaneously entail risk for biodiversity and also for ecosystem functioning. Therefore, yes, we need a good risk assessment that Anja told us how to do it, and also we need a good management of non-native trees. Katharina, you already told us how many of those species we have, more than 600 non-native tree species in urban and forest areas, and about 135 native tree species. And the frame of non-native management should be based on our past experiences and our experience that we have, also on benefits that non-native trees can give us, and at the same time we should be aware of risks of the non-native trees that they do have. So whether the species is native or non-native, management could increase the economic, environmental, and also social values of those tree species. First base is our experiences, and we have a long tradition in our forestry management practice regarding non-native tree species. And what we have learned that not all tree species have proven successful. Let's say Pinus strobus and many other species are not very successful in our forest environment due to different reasons. Some of them did develop invasive potential, but this is also site-specific. Some of them didn't, and there's only small proportion of those non-native trees have proven to be suitable species for our forests. But also, as Anja said, also it is very site-specific. We monitored, we collect, we process and harmonized existing information of non-native tree species distribution in Europe, and therefore all these tools are quite good to have in our hands for further decisions. So non-native tree species do not have the same culture, do not have the same historical values as native species, but they have been used as acceptable ecological substitutes in those cases where the benefits of their ecological functions are perceived to exceed the potential risk of introducing a non-native species. So what are benefits of non-native trees, or what are opportunities with non-native trees? For sure, one is increased yield in a short time, high biomass production, we can get valuable wood assortments, they can adapt to degraded lands. Also, non-native trees, some of them can quicker adapt to changing ecological conditions. They can better adapt to climate change. They are suitable for phytoremediation or highly degraded lands where native trees are not so successful. They can have high resistance to shallow soils or to dry sites. And regarding urban areas, they're nice green infrastructure and they have nice aesthetic function or value. So on the other side, we have risks. First, we should be aware that some of non-native trees can have high invasive potential, and that means that once we have it in our ecosystems, our natural biodiversity can decline. Actually, it can happen that non-native tree can alter the whole ecosystem function. And maybe sometimes we can, instead of increasing of biomass production, we can face a decreased yield and also decreased biomass production. Non-native trees can change, can deteriorate our soil conditions. And also there's a new ecosystem which non-native tree species are in, and that can increase susceptibility to biotic risks, to pests and diseases and so on. And a risk is also that we don't have, for many species that are coming or that we have, our knowledge of their behavior in a particular sites is very poor. So our project output in the ALPTREES project, we will make transnational strategy based of management and of responsible use non-native trees, which will lean on benefits, our risks, and our experiences with them. But we should take into account legal restrictions for growing non-native trees regarding each country involved in this alpine space. Also, each non-native tree species must be treated individually before introducing, according to risk, according to our experience, and according to benefits. Of course, management of invasive and harmful non-natives which are now present in our forests, there should be very clear measures of control should be given. But that's another story, and this is it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aleksander. I'm very thrilled that you pointed out in 5 minutes the main keystones of our work. Thank you very much. Could you stop sharing the screen, please?
No problem.
Thank you. So our next short presenter is already ready. Florian Kraxner is leading the work package 2. And if you're ready for your short presentation, you can start anytime.
Yeah, hello everybody. I will share the screen now. My name is Florian Kraxner from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. And I will tell you a little bit about our work that has to do with, according to the title, predicting the future. In fact, I would prefer if we call it rather projecting the future. And what is this projecting? It is basically creating maps of the future of something, and this something is in this case the alpine space, and here more specifically it is the forest in the alpine space. Also, we are trying to project the climate impact on this area and the risk that is imposed on the alpine forest, and therefore there is not only the risk mapping with respect to the introduction of a non-native species itself, but also the risk mapping with respect to the climate impact that is imposed on the forest, which is a very high risk, which we heard in almost all the presentations so far. Some clarifying words at the beginning. Please acknowledge that this is work in progress. So we are not even halfway through with our project, and therefore I'm going to show you what we have so far, and you will also see some basically mock-ups in some cases, and some examples that should help you to understand where we are heading, but which is of course no final result here. Okay, so some facts. We are talking about forest composition in the Alps. And this is the alpine shape with its present composition of some tree species accumulated. You see that this is in a roughly accumulated way already quite a impressive setup here. If we quickly look at the list on the right-hand side here, we can see that on the first glance, there are 3 non-native species included in this mapping that has been done by EFI and slightly modified by ourselves. For instance, eucalyptus or pseudotsuga or rubinia. Now, compared to the figures that we heard before, this is only 3 out of hundreds. And therefore, we need to take the full potential into account. That means we are going to assess the whole array of the available non-native tree species and what's their potential in the alpine region under the already mentioned climate change. in order to now make it easier for you, I'm even shrinking down this already reduced list to 3 basically aggregated tree species setups. And this is, in that case, you can see it on the right-hand side, a component where mostly Castanea is predominantly growing. Then in dark green, the absolute dominating tree species in the Alps. This is the famous spruce and other coniferous complex. And in light green, this is Fagus. This is the beech forest that is mostly also part of our relatively famous mixed forests in the Alps. So you can see this distribution here, and this is where we will concentrate on in our analysis, which quickly should explain you how we are doing this risk mapping with respect to climate change in the Alps. Okay, so these are some facts about the forest, and now let's look into the climate change ongoing in the alpine area. Don't be shocked now by a lot of graphs here. The simple understanding is here that we see different time horizons starting from the time around the present 2010, 2020. Then here we have 2050 and 2070, and we are talking here about the mean annual temperature to be expected in the ALPTREES or alpine space region under a warming scenario that basically extrapolates our business as usual, our present pathway. And this pathway clearly leads us to miss the Paris goals. So therefore, it is also so important to look into all options, mitigation, but also adaptation with respect to forests in the alpine space, who should play a very important role here. Okay, again, what can we see? We see in 2010, the mean annual temperature, in 2050, the mean annual temperature, and in 2070. And we see that the pictures are getting more and more red, which means mean annual temperatures are increasing. And the red zones are increasing more and more. This is particularly visible here, but also in the south, and only in the central, basically the high alpine area, mean annual temperatures are not growing so much. The relative shifts we can see here in the lower 2 graphs, and we see that there are some warming hotspots that starts between 2020 and 2050 in major areas around Switzerland and around the eastern part of Austria and Slovenia. And between 2050 and 2070, the relative changes in most of the alpine areas in terms of mean annual temperature are between 4 and 4.5 degrees already. So we are talking about mean annual temperatures. Now, part of the climate is, of course, not only temperature, but also precipitation is an important indicator here. Now we see the same setup for the mean annual precipitation, the absolute values in the top 3 graphs and figures, and the relative changes in the lower 2 graphs, again showing time steps between 2010, 2050, and 2070. And we see that in most of the regions, if we look at the relative change, we are losing precipitation. So everything in red and dark red is losing precipitation. And there are also some spots that are supposed to have or show an increase in precipitation. So this is the situation over the next coming decades. And this is also the challenge we are facing here when we would like to map the risks here. Now we have to play together the information that we have on the forest, on the species distribution, and on the climate change. And this is what we would like to show here. So what do we define as a risk? A risk is increasing if at the same time the temperature increases in an area, and in the same area the precipitation decreases. This means stress to the forests. Consequences are health problems, and in ultimate consequence then an attack, for instance, by bark beetle, as we can see now all over with respect to spruce trees. And we have identified now 3 major hotspot areas where these 2 components fall together: an increasing temperature and at the same time a decreasing precipitation. These 3 areas are in the northern area of Switzerland bordering Germany, then in the central eastern Alps, mostly in eastern part of Austria, and also in this area that is in the starting area of the Alps, so to say, where the Alps hit the Mediterranean climate. And here we can see that basically all 3 aggregated species compositions are hit by this climate change, and there are hotspots in the pure spruce area to the right. There are hotspots in the more mixed areas, that is the smaller one here in Switzerland and Germany, and there is a hotspot area for the Castanea. And now it is our task to think about what can be done in this area. Would, for instance, one of the many available non-native tree species and a change in management, on the other hand, help us out of this hotspot areas and help us adapting to climate change? And for that, it is always good also to use other sources than the pure scientific sources. In this case, we are using a citizen science component here. This means that the crowd, everybody, you and me, can contribute to non-native tree species identification in the areas of the Alps. We do this through this web link, which I indicated here. This is www.inaturalist.org, where we have established a special project for ALPTREES. And what is happening there is that people who like to be in the nature can identify, with the help of our support, non-native tree species in the forests. And you see observations here already. And now we can match these observations with our hotspot areas. And we see that there are a lot of observations of non-native tree species already here in the more Mediterranean hotspot area. And there are less observations of non-native tree species in the Switzerland bordering southern Germany area, and even less observations of non-native tree species in the central eastern Alps in Austria and northern part of Slovenia. This doesn't mean that there are non-native tree species, but this only means for the time being that they have not been observed there and uploaded to this iNaturalist database. However, this also gives us an indication where we have to put more emphasis on and where we then can also derive from some measurements whether non-native tree species, and if yes, which ones grow best in these areas. However, this data is then also used for forest modeling, and there will be a special presentation following mine, as far as I understand, purely on non-native tree species modeling. So what are the conclusions here from this risk mapping with respect to climate change impact? It is very clear that human-caused climate change impact has also strong impact on the alpine forest, where this high risk is identified, where the temperatures are growing and the precipitation is getting less. We have problems with growth, we have health problems, and we will have consequently a different distribution of trees in the future. The risk mapping is very important to identify the hotspots areas, as I have shown in my presentation. And hotspots are then these areas which we will primarily address with the ALPTREES modeling efforts. And based on that, we can then come up with very clear recommendations to decision makers that can be formulated, including, for instance, change of management, change of species, like Aleksander has shown this before. And with that, we can then come up with solutions for the future, solutions for the nature, the society, and also the economy. And with that, I would like to thank you very much. If you are interested in these kind of climate change risk mapping or hotspot identification, please contact me. This is a little snapshot of the smaller team that deals with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florian, for your short and very impressive work. And we have already the first questions coming up. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for too many questions, but there was the question why you choose the scenario 8.5.
Yeah, I could have chosen any other scenario, but I thought I have to show very clearly what might happen if we do not manage to reduce our emissions in time and very heavily. So it's kind of a doomsday scenario, but maybe the most rational at the moment.
This question was stated by Lado Kutner. If you want to add something on this.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then we have another question. What is the source for the forest cover data?
It's stated in the presentation. The forest composition map is taken from the European Forest Institute's map, where they did it for the entire Europe.
Perfect. Then
I
Dave has a question.
No, not a question. I will be very, very brief. Florian, I think the assessment, the criteria of assessment of the climate risk, rather than basing it on temperature and precipitation variation, if you also include the development of novel climate, I think that will give you a much more comprehensive picture of how the risks are going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's then there is a last question from the panelists. If this presentation is going to be online or shared with you, perhaps it will be, and we will send you all the information on where to watch it again just after this webinar. So thank you, Florian, Anja, and Aleksander, not only for your presentations, but also for your never-ending and very enthusiastic work in this project. You work very hard to reach these results. So thank you very much for everything you do in the ALPTREES project. Now we continue with a lecture on modeling the distribution of non-native tree species And this lecture is given by my dear colleague, Debojyoti Chakraborty, in fact, just sitting one room next to me. But I'm very happy that you join us and that you prepare a lecture for all those participants who joined us today who might be interested in learning more about how to model species distributions and what are the single steps behind each of it. Dave, will you be able to share your screen by yourself?
I'm not allowed.
Okay, sorry, I will. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, can you try again?
Your browser is preventing access to your share screen, they say.
Okay, don't worry. Then I will do this for you then.
Okay.
And just let me know. Okay. Do you see the first slide of your presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Just give me a hint to...
But it's not in the presentation mode.
It should be. 1 second. I'll do this again. Sorry for the inconvenience. Is it now?
Okay, good. Yeah, I can see it very well. Since I'm not being able to control the presentation, I will have to be a little faster. But I will start with thanking you for inviting me to this webinar. It was really nice to hear from all the participants the great work they are doing. So, although the title is Modeling Non-Native Tree Species Distribution, I will basically talk about tree species distribution, the modeling technique, and touching on what kind of caution and what kind of extra things we do when non-native tree species are the one that is being modeled. Next. Okay, so we all know that climate change is a real thing now, and like any other systems, forests are also going to be very strongly affected, but this effect is going to be spatially different. That means the same species of the forest trees will be affected differently in its geographic range. In the north, it can be affected by some other climatic factor. In the south, something else. So this is very important, that should be taken into consideration when we model distribution of trees, and we want to predict that into the future. Next. So by these changes in the climate, we are going to also encounter that the species share is going to change. That means the associated risks and as well as the associated benefits and ecosystem services are also going to change. And it is very difficult to observe this change through experiments because the trees are long-living communities spanning several decades. And therefore, we have to rely on some sort of modeling technique so that we can have some sort of mathematics or mathematical equations or some sort of statistical or combination of many different physiological and other traits, so that we can somehow look into the future and at least have a rough understanding of what is going to happen. Next. Next. Okay, so what we actually can do when we are facing climate change, to sum up all the adaptation techniques or adaptation strategies, we can roughly divide them into three lines of defense. So firstly, we can actually play with the native tree species by choosing what to plant. If we are going for a plantation, that means we are choosing adapted provenances or adapted genetic material within the native tree species. If this does not succeed, then we can look into dividing the plantation or our forest, dividing the risk by an insurance policy, like species mixture of native tree species so that we have the risks divided into a large range of species. If nothing succeeds, then only I think non-native tree species should be preferred, as also has been pointed out by a speaker who also presented that the risks of non-native tree species should be adequately assessed before preferring them, and we can actually have such a decision tree to see whether we have our native tree species that can also be used as an alternative when climate change is in question. Next. Okay, so one of the most commonly used modeling techniques to look into the future of how the tree species composition is going to be are known as distribution models or niche models or equilibrium models or bioclimatic envelope models. So these are basically the same kind of model but known differently using different terms. These models are basically not new. They have been in discussion and also been talked about for a very, very long time. Also before what I show here in the slide, like starting from Alexander Humboldt, our forefathers actually also knew from agriculture, for example, what to plant. They know what will grow in what kind of conditions. So this knowledge is actually very, very old, and this concept of niche is actually built on this old wisdom that our forefathers had. Next. So possible areas of this distribution model, so we can use these models to test hypotheses about species distribution. That means we want to know what drives species distribution, what climatic, non-climatic, cultural factors are actually behind in driving the distribution. That means why a tree species is present in a certain area and why it is not in other. So these kind of things can be tested with these models. Then reconstructing the distribution of the tree species and forecasting in the future so that decisions from policy angle or policy point of view can be taken. And also these models are also used to develop conservation and management strategies regarding the ongoing climate change. Next, please. Next, yeah. So as I already mentioned, this brings us to our high school lecture on ecological niche. So that means niche basically defines the address of a living organism, where exactly it is found. So when it comes to natural systems, I'm careful in talking about natural system because here I'm not talking about human beings, but rather than non-human natural system. So this is basically the address. That means where exactly we can find a species, be it tree, lizard, reptiles, mammals, whatever. So we have two different concepts of niche. Here we can see in this picture. If we think about a natural system defined by temperature, moisture, and altitude. So we have two different kinds of niche. The fundamental niche, where the species can possibly be found if all the conditions are satisfied. And realized niche is basically where the species is actually found when we take other limiting factors like dispersal limitation, competition, and all these problems that limit the species in occurring in the fundamental niche. So these are all the niche models are based on this fundamental assumption of biological or ecological niche. Next, please. So like all of the models, the ecological niche models also has very strong assumptions. Some of these assumptions are that the occurrence probability, that means if I find a tree species in a certain area, it has to be correlated with the environmental conditions. That means we take it into assumption, or we assume that environment or climate is something that is driving the species to occur in a particular location. This means that we will find species wherever the matching environment exists. So this is the very concept of the envelope. That means if the environment is matching, then it is high probability that the species will exist in that particular location. So this is very important also for non-native tree species. That means if a tree species occurring, say, from North America has similar environment in Europe, we assume that that non-native tree species has very high probability of occurring in Europe. Then equilibrium and habitat saturation, that means these models assume that all the environmentally suitable habitats are actually fully occupied. That means they do not take into consideration the limitations due to dispersal, like geographical limitation, etc. and etc. So this problem is actually, this assumption is problematic when we model invasive tree species. That means we are not taking into consideration dispersal limitations or dispersal non-limitations or benefits, or some species actually can disperse very well, and that is also one of the reasons why they are potentially invasive. So these models actually do not take normally these assumptions or these problems into account, but this should be taken into account. Next, please. Then biotic interactions, most of the niche models are based on the assumption that a tree species or any species existing means that it has survived the interaction. So this is again problematic for non-native tree species because we are excluding the assumption, or we are excluding the condition that there can be 2 or 3 or many different species co-occurring in a certain environment. And this assumption is problematic when we deal with non-native and potentially invasive tree species. And adaptation and evolution is also another major evolutionary or limitation, that niche models actually assume that the niche of its origin and where these tree species have colonized remains same. So this is again another important assumption that we should take into consideration when modeling non-native tree species. That means we should not assume that the environmental conditions of its origin and where it is colonized is going to be the same. It can be different, and if we do not take this into consideration, we are not modeling, then we cannot rely on the models that we built. Next, please. The advantages of these models are that they are basically simple in interpretation, and also they are simple in developing and calibration. They're easy to interpret, and the data that is required to build these kind of models are easily available, like very high quality occurrence data. That means where the species is occurring and not occurring, and climate data. For example, these days we have very high resolution climate data from a variety of platforms that is available. Next, please. The major limitations, as already I have touched upon, is that the causal drivers of these distribution are rarely quantified in this. So basically these models are correlative. So we cannot actually pinpoint what is driving the distribution, or because they are not based on functional traits, for example. So this is something which is limiting in these models. That's why before starting a model, we should be understanding, we should have a very strong understanding of what are its limitations and what are the major assumptions behind these models. Next, please. So there are also statistical issues. Maybe I will skip this because there is not so much time left. Yeah, there are many different ways in which we can do or we can develop these models, like statistical approaches like logistic regression, like generalized linear model where your data is not normally distributed, then generalized additive models, and so on. Next, please. And then also there is the plethora of techniques called the machine learning, which are basically divided into supervised and unsupervised learning. That means the computer learns from your data how the potential distribution of the species will be. So this is also gaining very popularity in the modeling world, because machine learning is something which is not, it has now actually embedded in all fields of modeling and artificial intelligence and so on. Next, please. So some of the popular machine learning algorithms can be random forest, classification tree, surface range envelope, multivariate adaptive regression splines, etc. Next, please. Now this is important. Maybe you skip this slide. I'll show it with a figure. So, for example, we have to also understand the difference between the mechanistic and correlative model. So here in these red dots, these are basically where a tree species has been observed in Europe. Next, please. So basically, this is what the envelope means. So that means if we draw a line around this occurrence, we are basically assuming that this defines the environmental conditions in which we can find these tree species. So this is what envelope model does, or ecological niche models, or any distribution model does. Next. Now, when we translate this envelope into a factor of limitations like temperature and precipitation, we can have a very simple model where a tree species is found in a certain range of precipitation and temperature. We can have n number of different factors. Next, please. So this is again what the envelope does. So we draw an envelope around these limiting factors, and we assume that we have captured all the conditions in which the tree species is going to occur. Next. The mechanistic model, on the other hand, basically tries to model the fundamental niche. So one example is that if we get data on productivity, so that means, say, Norway spruce grows from -5 to, say, +25 degrees Celsius, and then we can somehow limit this curve, and we can set threshold that Norway spruce is going to be found where the temperature, so I'm just talking about temperature, it can be like many other climatic factors. So if we cut the threshold, we can somehow define where the tree species has the probability of not only being found, but also developing and also surviving and so on. So this is a much better approach than the traditional envelope model, but the problem is that they are computationally intensive and data intensive. So this is roughly the difference between the correlative and the mechanistic model. Next. So this again translates into the envelope. So we define the envelope with a trait. That means we define the envelope with the productivity trait, for example. Next. Next. Okay, so what do we need to develop these models? So we need data, at least two different things. One, we need the presence and absence of the tree species that we are going to model. And we at least need some traits or some drivers that define the environmental factors like temperature, precipitation, growing degree days, moisture, and so on. So, but if we have other data like soil, like land use and so on, then the models get better and better when we have all the different kinds of limiting factors incorporated into the model. So many different sources from where you can get this occurrence data. For example, this Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Next, forest inventories. Climate data is also very easily available. We also have our own from BFV now, which is going to be out next in a couple of weeks. Next, soil data, for example, it's very rare to find soil data, but at least in the European context, we have this European soil database, which at least give you some idea of different soil attributes like pH, texture, bulk density, available soil moisture, and so on. Next. Then land use data, Eurosat, Corin dataset, and you guys know, I think, all of it. It's just to reiterate that these are the different sources that you can get this data from. Next, please. Elevation data also is very handy to develop these kind of models. Next. So now it is important to actually evaluate how good your data is. That means, are the presence data really capturing all the places where you can find these species or not. This is something which is very important for non-native tree species. For example, if I get a tree species that originates from Asia and it is available in Europe, the data should be good enough to say that all the potential places where we can actually find these tree species should be actually captured by my data. But it is very rare to find such data for non-native tree species, because many a time for cultural reasons that the tree species is not certainly present in certain location because I have not planted it, or it is present in a certain location because it is invasive. So all these things actually influence the data quality and should be taken into consideration when we model especially non-native tree species. Next. One important consideration that is required for the envelope model or distribution model is that rarely we have absence locations in our data set. So what we can basically do is to generate something called pseudo absence. And there are many different ways of doing it, but most of the time these are randomly taken points outside the geographic location of the currently observed presences. But this is something which we have very strongly disputed in a work of ours recently. So we have actually formulated a way of defining the potential absences by first defining a threshold of geographic location outside our presences, and then somehow climatically distinguishing or separating the absence locations from the presences. That means we are very sure with this approach that our tree species is not present in a place where it is not supposed to be climatically. So this is what basically does this algorithm that we have developed. Next. So this is basically what summarizes how or what goes into developing a niche model. So we have occurrence data, all these red points that you can see in this map. And then we have a lot of environmental data, be it soil, climate, and so on. And then we have a data matrix. So here you have the X, Y coordinates and the different environmental limitations or values, and you have whether the tree species is present or absent. And then you fit the models with different kinds of algorithms. And then what you get as an output is a habitat suitability map, or rather than you can call a potential distribution map. That means it gives you an idea of where in a 1 by 1 kilometer or 10 by 10 kilometer, depending on your resolution, my species of interest has a probability of occurring that the climate is conducive. So this is what the output is. So this has to be very clear that we are not providing an answer that the tree species will be found here. So it provides you a condition that the tree species have a probability that you can find the tree species in this location if the climate is conducive, if we talk only about climate. Next, please. Now, when we have developed the model, we have different approaches to evaluate that the model is somehow doing justice to the data with which the model was developed. The ideal case is that we get independent data and we evaluate our model statistically. There are many different approaches. When I'm not going detailed into those approaches, but if ideal situation does not permit that you don't have independent data, then one way is to split your occurrence data into training and evaluation, and to run the models into both the sets and to see how the statistics of the accuracy performs. Next. So by accuracy statistics, I mean that when you evaluate your model, you have two different outputs. That means whether the model correctly predicts the presences as presence, or it predicts the presences as absence. So we have the true positives, or we have the false positives, and the false and the true negatives. So all the evaluation and the validation is basically based on this false and true, positive and negative. So this is what we call as the confusion matrix. So all this data and all this evaluation is actually based on this confusion matrix. Next, please. Now, the challenges of predicting or modeling non-native tree species, that the correlation of occurrence of the environment may change. So as I pointed out, that it is not enough that you just model the occurrence of climate and soil and you predict in the future. You have to take into consideration that how novel the climate is going to be where you are going to predict. And this is something extremely important when you are going to do predictions for non-native tree species. And since no mechanism is usually involved in these kind of models, it is very important that we do some sort of an ensemble modeling. So that means we use a lot of different modeling approaches, and then we somehow try to combine the strengths of each of these models, and then we can produce, or we can actually take the uncertainties not only of climate change but also from the different modeling algorithms also into the picture. Next. So this is what I called just discussed about the niche conservation. So this is the case of Robinia pseudoacacia, and these axes basically are the axis of temperature, precipitation in a principal component. So we can see that the native range in terms of its climatic niche and the non-native range in Europe has quite some areas where they do not overlap. So they are completely new, for example. So this is something which is very, very important when we model non-native tree species. We also have to take into consideration how different the requirements are in the introduced range of the species. Next. So one important limitation of the distribution model is that they never actually take genetics into consideration when they model. So this is the case of Soidetsuga menziesii or Douglas fir. We all know that it has two major varieties, the blue variety and the green variety, and depending on that they have many completely different traits. So next. So this is what we did in a work. We actually tried to predict the distribution based on where we get the tree seeds from in North America and plant in Europe. So we can see that if the seed comes from colder locations, they have considerably smaller distribution range, not only in the current, but also in the future scenarios compared to if we get the seeds from comparatively warmer locations. So this is something which is also important when it comes to non-native tree species, that we should also, if possible, take genetics into consideration. Next, please. So I'm sorry I had to really rush through these slides. I hope I could make some sense at least. Thank you for your attention, and if there is any question, I'll be glad to answer.
Thank you very much, Dave, for this wonderful lecture. Just for information, we have recorded it and you will be able to listen to it and also share it maybe to others who might be interested in the more detailed work in modeling. So is there a question for the end of our webinar? Dave, there is no more follow-up question for you. If there is some, I'm sure you're available through email and other possibilities to contact you. And thank you again very much.
Thank you
for your lecture. We have reached the end of our webinar. At this point, I would like to thank one more time to all the panelists and all our participants who joined the webinar today. It was a great experience for us to share our ongoing work and our keystones and our messages, and also to give you some insights from all the work that is, all the steps which are behind our results, which will come up hopefully within the next half a year. So keep in touch with the ALPTREES project. When you're exiting this webinar room, you will be invited to participate in a survey to give us a feedback, how you liked it, what you could improve next time. And we hope to see you again at the digital conference in February or at any other occasion, which we will update you constantly in our newsletters and social media channels. So thanks again, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.